In the spring of 2023, a trail camera mounted to a pine tree in the Dos Cabezas Mountains of southeastern Arizona captured an image that circulated briefly through wildlife biology circles before reaching the broader public. The image showed a large cat moving through a rocky drainage in the early morning hours, its spotted coat unmistakable against the pale substrate of the desert floor. If what you just heard makes you want to keep going, stay here. This is exactly the kind of content we make, and there is a lot more of it. Subscribe now so you do not miss what comes next. The animal was a jaguar. It was large, healthy-looking, and moving with the unhurried confidence of an animal that believed itself unobserved. Wildlife managers confirmed the identification within days. The cat was male. It had not been previously documented in the United States. It became, in the official accounting maintained by the wildlife agencies that track such things, the 8th jaguar photographically documented in the American Southwest in the past 30 years. The coverage was brief. A handful of regional outlets ran the story. A few national publications picked it up and let it go within a news cycle. The standard language appeared in every account: historic, rare, thrilling. A reminder of what wild places still hold. None of it was wrong. All of it was incomplete. What the coverage did not explore, because exploring it would require sitting with a set of facts that resist the simple narrative arc of conservation success or conservation failure that journalism about wildlife tends to reach for, is what 8 jaguars in 30 years actually means, where those animals came from, why they keep appearing, and what the gap between their presence in Arizona and their absence from any functioning, breeding population in the United States tells us about one of the most consequential and least understood rewilding questions in North American conservation. The jaguar is in the American Southwest. It has been there, intermittently, for as long as the region has had people capable of recording its presence. What it has not been is established. What it has not done, despite the cameras, despite the confirmed sightings, despite the advocacy, is form a population. The gap between presence and establishment is not a gap in time. It is a gap in policy, geography, biology, and political will that has been actively maintained by human decisions and passively perpetuated by human inattention. Understanding it requires going back much further than 2023 or 1996 or any other date in the modern conservation record. It requires understanding what the jaguar actually is, where it actually came from, and what it was doing in the Dos Cabezas Mountains before European settlement made that question seem remarkable rather than obvious. If you are watching this, and you care about the story of wildlife in wild places, subscribe before you go any further. This is the kind of story that takes time to tell properly, and there are more of them coming. The jaguar is the largest cat in the Western Hemisphere and the 3rd largest cat in the world, exceeded only by the lion and the tiger. That fact alone carries a weight that is easy to pass over too quickly when reading it for the first time, because the Western Hemisphere is a large place and the animal that stands at the apex of its terrestrial predator hierarchy tends not to occupy the same mental space for most North Americans as the lions and tigers that have anchored the cultural imagination of large cats for centuries. The jaguar occupies a different register in the North American imagination. It is exotic in the sense of being geographically associated with somewhere else, with the Amazon, with Belize, with the river systems of the Pantanal, with places that carry the weight of biological superlatives in the way that the southwestern United States does not, at least not in the conventional understanding. This geographic misassignment is itself part of the problem. The jaguar is not a Central American or South American animal that occasionally wanders into the United States. It is, or was, a North American animal that has been eliminated from the vast majority of its historical North American range by a combination of direct persecution, habitat alteration, and the progressive destruction of prey populations that began in earnest in the 19th century and has not fully stopped. The historical range of the jaguar in North America extended from the Gulf Coast of Texas, westward across New Mexico and Arizona, northward into the mountains of Colorado and possibly Utah, and encompassed, essentially, the entire southwestern quadrant of what is now the United States. Fossil records, Native American accounts, early colonial documentation, and the remnant population genetics of surviving jaguar populations in Mexico all point to the same conclusion. The jaguar was not a rare visitor to the American Southwest. It was a resident. It denned in the Sky Island mountain ranges that rise from the Sonoran and Chihuahuan deserts. It hunted deer, peccary, and the pronghorn and bighorn that were then abundant across a landscape that had not yet been grazed to depletion or broken into fragments by roads and fences and water projects. It was documented by Spanish explorers in Sonora and Chihuahua in the 16th century in terms that described not occasional animals passing through, but a predator occupying a known ecological role in an intact system. When American ranchers and hunters arrived in the Southwest in the 19th century, they did not find a place that jaguars occasionally visited. They found a place where jaguars lived, and they set about removing them with the systematic efficiency that characterized the large predator eradication campaigns of that era. The campaign against jaguars in the American Southwest operated through the same mechanisms as the campaigns against wolves and grizzly bears that proceeded in parallel. Federal predator control programs, initially administered through the Bureau of Biological Survey and later the Fish and Wildlife Service, employed full-time hunters and trappers whose professional purpose was the elimination of animals perceived as threats to the livestock operations that had become the economic backbone of the region. Bounties paid by state governments and livestock associations provided a financial incentive that extended the killing effort beyond the federal employees. The last confirmed female jaguar in the United States was shot in Arizona in 1963. By the time the Endangered Species Act was passed in 1973, the jaguar's functional extinction in the United States was already complete. There were no breeding pairs. There were no established territories. There were, occasionally, lone males moving north from Sonora, where a small, beleaguered population was managing to persist in the mountain ranges along the U.S.-Mexico border. These animals crossed into the United States, were sometimes photographed, were sometimes shot, and were not followed up with anything resembling a coordinated recovery effort. The 30-year record of trail camera documentation that the 2023 Dos Cabezas sighting has now extended begins, in its modern form, in 1996. In August of that year, a rancher and hunter named Warner Glenn was running mountain lions with dogs in the Peloncillo Mountains along the Arizona-New Mexico border when his dogs treed an animal he did not expect. It was a jaguar. Glenn, to his considerable credit, did not shoot it. He photographed it. The photographs, published in Arizona newspapers and eventually in a widely circulated wildlife magazine, represented the first undisputed documentation of a jaguar in the United States in decades. The reaction from wildlife agencies was cautious. The reaction from conservationists was immediate and significant. Glenn became an unlikely figure in the jaguar advocacy world. A rancher who had his opportunity to kill one of the rarest animals in the country and chose documentation over a trophy, an act of restraint that shaped the subsequent public narrative around jaguar conservation in ways that continue to matter. Following the 1996 Glenn sighting, additional trail camera images and sightings accumulated over the following years. A second animal, photographed in the Peloncillos in 1996 and again in 2001, appeared to be a different individual from Glenn's animal based on spot pattern analysis, which is the primary method used to identify individual jaguars, since each animal's rosette pattern is unique in the way that a fingerprint is unique. A third jaguar, photographed extensively in the Babaquivari Mountains west of Tucson between 2004 and 2007, was named Macho B by the researchers tracking it, and became one of the most documented wild jaguars in American history. Macho B was accidentally captured in a leg snare in 2009, fitted with a GPS collar by Arizona Game and Fish Department personnel, and released. He was recaptured 13 days later, euthanized due to kidney failure that was determined to have resulted, at least in part, from the stress of capture, and became the center of a controversy about handling protocols and research ethics that resulted in a criminal investigation and a guilty plea from one of the researchers involved in his capture. He was estimated to be between 15 and 16 years old at the time of his death. He was the last survivor of a generation of jaguars that had persisted in the borderlands as individuals without any possibility of forming a population. Old males from a Mexican source population slowly dying out in a landscape that had nothing to replace them. The interval between Macho B's death in 2009 and the next confirmed jaguar documentation in the United States was not long. By 2011, trail cameras operated by a coalition of conservation organizations and federal agencies in the Huachuca and Santa Rita Mountains were producing images of a new animal, younger, with a different spot pattern, clearly not one of the individuals from the earlier decade. This animal, subsequently named El Jefe, became the most extensively documented jaguar in modern American history, photographed hundreds of times over the course of several years by the volunteer monitoring network that had been established in the wake of the earlier sightings. El Jefe was a young adult male in apparent good health, moving across a territory that included some of the most human-modified landscapes in southeastern Arizona, passing through ranch land, crossing roads, navigating the outer edges of suburban Tucson sprawl, and apparently finding sufficient prey in the patchwork of desert grassland and oak woodland that constitutes the Sky Island habitat of the region. His images circulated widely. He attracted the kind of public attention that individual animals with names and long documentation records tend to attract, the same attention that has attached to individual wolves in Yellowstone, individual bears in Katmai, individual orcas in the Salish Sea, the attention that transforms a biological entity into a narrative protagonist with stakes and a future that the public can care about. El Jefe was last photographed in the United States in early 2015. He was next confirmed in Sonora, Mexico, approximately a year later, having crossed the international border and moved south into the mountain ranges, where the small Mexican jaguar population he had come from continued to persist. His departure from the United States received less coverage than his presence had. The cameras that had tracked him for years continued to run, producing no jaguar images for an extended period, and the monitoring network that had been built around him continued to operate in the expectation, which proved correct, that the border population of Sonoran jaguars would continue to produce male animals that dispersed northward into the United States. The question was never whether more jaguars would appear. The question was, what would be done when they did? The political and legal history of jaguar conservation in the United States runs parallel to the biological record and is in some ways more consequential for understanding the animal's future than any amount of trail camera footage. The jaguar was listed as endangered under the Endangered Species Act in 1997, the year after the Warner Glenn photographs forced the issue into public awareness. The listing itself was not the difficult part. What followed was a protracted legal and administrative struggle over what the listing actually required the federal government to do, specifically whether it required the designation of critical habitat in the United States and the development of a recovery plan with measurable goals and enforceable timelines. The Fish and Wildlife Service's position for most of the period between 1997 and 2014 was that recovery of the jaguar in the United States was essentially not the agency's responsibility, because the species' viable populations existed in Mexico and Central and South America, and that designating critical habitat in the United States for an animal it classified as a foreign species was neither legally required nor biologically meaningful. This position was challenged repeatedly in federal court by conservation organizations and was ultimately overturned. Critical habitat for the jaguar in the United States was formally designated in 2014, covering approximately 764,000 acres in Arizona and New Mexico. A recovery plan followed in 2018. Both documents acknowledged what the biological record had been showing for decades, that the Sky Island mountain ranges of the American Southwest represent the historical and potential northern range of a species that should, if conditions were different, be a resident rather than a visitor. The critical habitat designation and the recovery plan exist now as legal documents, with enforceable consequences for federal land management decisions. They do not, by themselves, produce jaguars. What produces jaguars is the Sonoran jaguar population in Mexico, specifically the breeding females in the Sierra Madre Occidental that give birth to male cubs, some proportion of which disperse northward as young adults seeking to establish territories outside the competition radius of older resident males. The dispersal corridor that connects the Mexican source population to the Arizona critical habitat crosses the international border through a landscape that has been progressively modified by border security infrastructure. The vehicle barriers, pedestrian fencing, and surveillance technology that have been installed along the US-Mexico border in the Sky Island region since the early 2000s have altered the landscape in ways that affect jaguar movement even when the physical structures are not absolutely impassable to an animal of the jaguar's size and athleticism. The consolidation of human border patrol activity, vehicle traffic, light, noise, and the behavioral disturbance associated with border enforcement creates a corridor of elevated human activity that represents a meaningful deterrent to jaguar movement, even where the physical infrastructure does not constitute an impenetrable barrier. This matters because the dispersal of males from Mexico into Arizona is the mechanism by which any American jaguar presence is maintained, and because the conditions of that dispersal corridor are determined by policy decisions that have nothing to do with jaguar biology and everything to do with politics that jaguar advocates have largely not been successful in engaging. The nature of the Sonoran jaguar population that produces these dispersing males deserves careful attention because it is the foundation of everything else. The jaguars that appear in Arizona and New Mexico trail camera images are, with high probability, animals that were born in the mountain ranges of Sonora State in northwestern Mexico, specifically in the area around the Sierra Madre foothills that has been identified by Mexican wildlife researchers as the core of the northwestern jaguar subpopulation. This subpopulation is genetically distinct from jaguar populations further south and represents the northernmost breeding population in the species' current range. It is not large. Population estimates for the Sonoran jaguar population have varied widely, depending on methodology, but converging analyses suggest a breeding population of somewhere between 80 and 150 individuals, with total population including non-breeding males in the range of 100 to 200 animals. These are not comfortable numbers for a population that is also the source of the only jaguars that ever appear in the United States. The Sonoran population is not under immediate existential threat. It is under sustained pressure from habitat fragmentation, prey depletion in some areas, and the ranching conflicts that have characterized human-jaguar relations in northwestern Mexico for generations. Its persistence is not guaranteed by current conditions. It requires active management, habitat protection, and the kind of binational coordination that has been discussed at the policy level for decades without producing the institutional infrastructure that would make it durable. The question of whether a self-sustaining jaguar population can ever exist in the United States, independent of immigration from Mexico, is one that wildlife biologists have addressed with varying degrees of directness. The answer that emerges from the technical literature, when stripped of the diplomatic language that often cushions such assessments in official recovery documents, is that a self-sustaining American jaguar population would require breeding females to establish territories north of the border. Breeding females have not been documented in the United States since the 1960s. All 8 of the documented jaguars in the 30-year camera record are male. This is not coincidence, and it is not simply a function of small sample size. It reflects the dispersal biology of the jaguar, in which young males are the primary long-distance dispersers, and females tend to establish territories much closer to where they were born, within or adjacent to their natal range, rather than at the leading edge of a range expansion. For a breeding female to appear in Arizona, the population of females in Sonora would need to be large enough and productive enough that female dispersal was occurring to the edges of the Mexican range and then beyond the border. Current population conditions in Sonora do not appear to have reached that threshold. The males appearing in Arizona are the leading wave of a population that has not yet built up sufficient density and productivity in Mexico to produce female dispersal across the international border. This is the biological reality that the trail camera images document without communicating. Each new jaguar photograph is genuinely significant as evidence of continued movement and continued connectivity between the Mexican source population and the Arizona landscape. It is evidence that the corridor functions at some level. It is not evidence that recovery is occurring in any sense that the word is typically understood in wildlife management. Recovery implies population growth, breeding, self-sustaining reproduction in the area being recovered. None of those things are happening in the United States. What is happening is dispersal from a small, geographically isolated, internationally stranded source population into territory that could theoretically support breeding animals, if breeding females were present, and if the conditions for their survival and reproduction were maintained across a landscape that currently does not fully provide them. The prey-based question is one of the central practical concerns that the political and legal record of jaguar conservation has been slower to address than the habitat designation and corridor protection issues. Jaguars are generalist predators in the sense that they take a wider range of prey species than most large cats, including fish, reptiles, medium-sized mammals, and all available ungulate species. But their population dynamics, the density and productivity of breeding females, and the territory sizes of resident males are fundamentally driven by the availability of large prey, specifically deer and peccary, in the Sonoran landscape. The Sky Island ranges of southeastern Arizona and southwestern New Mexico contain both Coues white-tailed deer and collared peccary in numbers that represent a meaningful prey base. They also contain mule deer in lower density than the historical record suggests was once present, bighorn sheep in recovering but still reduced populations, and the full suite of medium-sized prey that would supplement the diet of a resident jaguar. Whether the prey base is sufficient to support a stable resident jaguar population is a question that has not been fully answered by empirical research, because there has not been a stable resident jaguar population to study. The theoretical carrying capacity analyses that have been done suggest the habitat could support somewhere between a handful and a few dozen resident animals, depending on assumptions about territory size, prey density, and the degree of human-caused mortality. The range of estimates reflects the genuine uncertainty in the underlying parameters rather than a failure of analysis. The livestock conflict dimension of jaguar recovery in the United States has received less attention than it deserves, partly because the documented record of jaguar depredation on U.S. livestock is thin due to the rarity of resident animals, and partly because the ranching communities most likely to coexist with resident jaguars have been engaged in the conservation process with varying degrees of cooperation that advocates have been careful to cultivate. The Warner Glen story, which began with a man who could have shot a jaguar and chose not to, has been a touchstone for the argument that ranchers and jaguar advocates can find common ground. In the decades since, some of the most valuable jaguar monitoring work in both Arizona and Sonora has been conducted on private ranches by researchers working with the cooperation of ranch owners and managers who have chosen to treat jaguar presence as something other than an operational problem. That cooperation is real and meaningful and should not be minimized. It is also not universal, and it is not guaranteed to survive the stress of actual livestock losses at the scale that a resident jaguar population would produce. A single, established male jaguar with a territory in the Sky Island ranges would take some number of cattle per year in addition to wild prey. A breeding population of multiple adults with overlapping territories and cubs to provision would take more. The ranching economics of the Sky Island region, already under pressure from drought, land values, regulatory complexity, and the intergenerational transfer challenges that are reshaping private land ownership across the rural West, do not have a lot of room to absorb uncompensated livestock losses. The compensation programs that exist for wolf depredation in the Northern Rockies represent one model for addressing this. Their application to jaguar recovery in the Southwest would require funding, administrative infrastructure, and a political commitment that has not yet been fully assembled. The international dimension of jaguar recovery is the dimension that most distinguishes it from the recovery of other large carnivores in the American West, and that makes it, from a policy standpoint, among the most complex wildlife conservation challenges in North American history. The wolves that were reintroduced to Yellowstone in 1995 came from Canada, but the recovery process, once the animals were established, was a domestic wildlife management challenge. The jaguar's recovery in the United States depends entirely on the health and productivity of a population in Mexico, managed by Mexican agencies under Mexican law, with Mexican funding priorities and subject to the pressures of Mexican ranching culture, land tenure systems, and political economy. No American conservation organization, no federal agency, and no amount of critical habitat designation in Arizona changes what happens to jaguar breeding females in Sonora. The binational Jaguar Recovery Team, which has worked to coordinate American and Mexican conservation efforts since the early 2000s, represents a genuine institutional achievement in a policy space where such coordination is structurally difficult. Its work has been important, and its continuation is essential. It is not a substitute for the kind of formal binational commitment backed by sustained funding on both sides of the border that the recovery of the northwestern jaguar subpopulation actually requires. The Dos Cabezas Mountains, where the 8th documented jaguar in 30 years was captured on a trail camera in 2023, sit in Cochise County in the southeastern corner of Arizona. They are part of the Sky Island archipelago, the chain of mountain ranges that rise like biological islands from the surrounding desert sea, isolated from each other by valleys of desert grassland, and from the Sierra Madre of Mexico by the political boundary of the international border. The Sky Island ranges are among the most biologically diverse landscapes in North America, a consequence of their position at the intersection of the Rocky Mountain, Sierra Madrean, Chihuahuan Desert, and Sonoran Desert bioregions, which produces an extraordinary compression of ecological zones within relatively small geographic areas. The Dos Cabezas specifically are not among the most prominent of the Sky Island ranges in terms of elevation or extent. They are smaller and lower than the Chiricahuas to their east or the Grahams to their north. But they are connected by desert valleys and grassland corridors to the broader Sky Island network, and the Jaguar documented there in 2023 had clearly been moving through that network in the way that dispersing males use landscape features to navigate between areas of suitable habitat. What the 2023 animal's presence in the Dos Cabezas tells us about jaguar movement ecology in the current period is actually something more interesting than simple confirmation that jaguars continue to appear in Arizona. The Dos Cabezas are not a range where jaguar monitoring has been concentrated in the past. The camera that captured the image was a game camera operated by a private citizen, not part of the coordinated monitoring network that has been running in the Huachucas, Santa Ritas, and Peloncillos since the mid-2000s. The animal's presence there suggests either that it was using the range as part of a larger movement pattern that took it through multiple Sky Island ranges, or that there is jaguar activity occurring in the broader Sky Island system that the existing monitoring network, which is substantial but not comprehensive, is not fully capturing. Both possibilities are significant. The first suggests a movement ecology in which individual male jaguars may be ranging across larger portions of the Sky Island system than previous documentation had indicated, potentially connecting ranges that had been thought to be outside the regular movement corridor. The second suggests that the actual frequency of jaguar presence in the American Southwest may be higher than the confirmed documentation record reflects, because the documentation record is constrained by where cameras are placed, and cameras are placed where researchers and monitors have reason to believe jaguars move, which creates a self-referential limitation on the ability of the existing network to detect animals using unexpected terrain. The monitoring network itself represents an extraordinary collective effort that deserves more public recognition than it typically receives. The Northern Jaguar Project, Sky Island Alliance, and Wildcat Ridge Sanctuary, among other organizations, have operated and maintained trail camera arrays across southeastern Arizona and southwestern New Mexico for years, with the volunteer labor of hundreds of individuals who check cameras, download images, analyze spot patterns, and maintain the documentation database that constitutes the evidentiary foundation of the American jaguar record. The federal agencies, primarily the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the Bureau of Land Management, have contributed resources and coordination capacity. The cooperation of private landowners on whose property cameras are placed has been essential. The result is a monitoring infrastructure that is genuinely impressive given the resources available to it, and that would be impossible to replicate with purely governmental capacity at current funding levels. It has also produced, through sheer accumulation of documented evidence over decades, the evidentiary record that made the 2014 critical habitat designation legally defensible in federal court, and that will underpin any future legal or administrative actions to strengthen jaguar protection in the region. The political context in which jaguar conservation operates in the American Southwest is one that has shifted significantly over the past decade in ways that are not uniformly positive for the species. The border region where jaguar movement between Mexico and the United States occurs has become one of the most politically charged landscapes in the country, overlaid with immigration enforcement debates, border wall construction disputes, and the complex politics of federal land management in states where the relationship between local communities and federal agencies has historically been adversarial. Infrastructure decisions made on border security grounds have created physical and behavioral barriers to jaguar movement without any requirement to consult the jaguar recovery process or assess biological impacts. The waiver authority under Section 102 of the Real ID Act, which allows the Secretary of Homeland Security to waive compliance with environmental laws, including the Endangered Species Act, for border wall construction, has been used to authorize construction in areas that overlap with documented jaguar movement corridors. The legal challenges to those waivers by conservation organizations have been uniformly unsuccessful because the statutory authority of the waiver is extremely broad. The result is that the most legally significant wildlife protection instrument in American law, the ESA listing and critical habitat designation that required years of litigation to achieve, has a specific and significant vulnerability in the precise geographic area where it matters most for the jaguar's recovery. The broader landscape of jaguar conservation in Latin America provides the context without which the American situation cannot be properly understood, and it is a context that contains both genuine cause for optimism and serious reasons for concern. The global jaguar population is estimated at between 64,000 and 173,000 individuals, a range that reflects the genuine difficulty of surveying a cryptic, low-density apex predator across a range that extends from Mexico to Argentina and includes some of the most remote and least accessible terrain on Earth. The species is classified as near-threatened on the IUCN Red List, a designation that reflects a population that has declined significantly from its historical numbers but is not in immediate danger of global extinction. The Pantanal of Brazil, Bolivia, and Paraguay hosts the densest known jaguar population in the world and has attracted substantial conservation investment and attention. The Amazon basin hosts large numbers of jaguars in core habitat that, despite the ongoing catastrophe of deforestation, still constitutes a vast reservoir of potential jaguar habitat. The Mesoamerican Jaguar Corridor, a conservation planning initiative that has sought to maintain or restore habitat connectivity from Mexico through Central America, has achieved meaningful protections in some areas and seen significant setbacks in others. The northwestern jaguar subpopulation that produces the animals appearing in Arizona sits at the northern extreme of this range and is separated from the main body of the jaguar's distribution by significant geographic and habitat gaps. The genetics of the Sonoran jaguar population reflect centuries of relative isolation from the larger populations to their south, an isolation that has been deepening as development in the Sierra Madre foothills has reduced connectivity between the northwestern population and the broader Mexican jaguar distribution. The northwestern jaguars are genetically distinctive. They carry alleles and haplotypes not found at high frequency in other populations. Their loss would represent not just a numerical reduction in the global jaguar count, but the elimination of a unique genetic legacy and the extinguishing of the northernmost expression of the species' geographic and adaptive range. Conservation geneticists who have analyzed the population structure of the northwestern jaguars have described their situation as one of the more concerning in the species range from a long-term viability standpoint, precisely because their isolation makes them vulnerable to the genetic and demographic consequences of small population size without the rescue effect of immigration from neighboring populations. The 8 jaguars, documented in the American Southwest over 30 years, cannot be understood without this broader context, because the number 8 is not simply an accounting of individual animals. It is a reflection of a demographic and ecological process playing out at the scale of the entire northwestern jaguar subpopulation, in which dispersing males represent a small and variable fraction of a struggling source population that is simultaneously producing those animals and failing to produce the female dispersal that would be required for any of them to become founders of an American breeding population. The 8 animals represent the visible tip of a much larger set of biological and policy dynamics, and treating them as simply 8 wonderful sightings of a wonderful animal is a form of narrative comfort that costs something real in terms of the analytical clarity that effective conservation requires. What would it actually take to achieve jaguar recovery in the American Southwest, in the sense that the recovery plan defines, meaning self-sustaining populations in suitable habitat on both sides of the border, connected by functional movement corridors? The recovery plan itself identifies a set of conditions and benchmarks, but the distance between those benchmarks and current conditions is worth stating plainly because it is rarely communicated in the coverage that individual jaguar sightings generate. It would require a Sonoran jaguar population large and productive enough to generate consistent female dispersal to the northern edge of its range in Mexico. It would require that dispersing females find conditions in the northern Sonoran Mountains and the Sky Island ranges that are sufficient for territory establishment, which means adequate prey, adequate cover, and adequate freedom from persecution to survive long enough to breed. It would require that those conditions persist across a landscape where ranching, border enforcement activity, and recreational use are all present and are all subject to human decisions that are made without primary reference to jaguar biology. It would require the maintenance or restoration of movement corridors between the mountain ranges where breeding females might establish themselves, and the broader system of Sky Island habitat that could support a population of multiple territories. It would require, at minimum, a generation of time during which all of these conditions are simultaneously maintained. This is not an impossible program. It is not even an unreasonable one, measured against what has been accomplished for other large carnivores in other parts of North America. It is a program that requires sustained commitment, binational coordination, and the kind of political durability that large wildlife conservation projects have historically struggled to maintain against the short-term pressures of human land use and political cycle. The grizzly bear provides an instructive comparison. Grizzly bears were eliminated from the American Southwest, including Arizona and New Mexico, in the same campaign that eliminated the jaguar. The last documented grizzly in Arizona was killed in the 1930s. The grizzly's recovery in the northern Rockies, driven by Yellowstone and the Northern Continental Divide ecosystems, has been one of the most consequential large carnivore conservation stories in American history. A genuine recovery from a functionally extinct status in the lower 48 states to a population of over 1,700 animals that has met or exceeded most of the biological recovery criteria established by the Fish and Wildlife Service. The grizzly recovery succeeded because it had a source population that was geographically accessible, because the habitat into which bears were recovering was largely federal land under management frameworks that could accommodate recovery objectives, because the political will to sustain the recovery through multiple administrations and multiple legal challenges was maintained over decades, and because the biological productivity of grizzlies, with females capable of raising multiple cubs in a territory, allowed the population to grow meaningfully once conditions were stabilized. The jaguar's situation differs from the grizzlies in each of these dimensions in ways that make recovery harder, not easier. The source population is in another country. The key habitat is a mix of federal and private land under varying management frameworks. The political durability of the recovery program has been tested repeatedly and has not always held. The reproductive rate of female jaguars, comparable to grizzlies in terms of litter size but potentially limited by habitat quality, prey availability, and mortality risk in ways that are not fully characterized for the Sonoran population, may not provide the same demographic resilience that allowed the grizzly population to absorb mortality and still grow. The wolf comparison is even more instructive and more uncomfortable for jaguar advocates, because the wolf recovery in the Southwest, specifically the Mexican gray wolf or Lobo program in Arizona and New Mexico, represents the closest analog to what jaguar recovery would actually involve, and has produced a political and biological record that is both inspiring and sobering. The Mexican gray wolf was reintroduced to the Blue Range wolf recovery area in eastern Arizona and western New Mexico in 1998. The reintroduction involved bringing captive bred animals from a carefully managed breeding program back to a portion of their historical range on federal land managed by the Forest Service and Fish and Wildlife Service. After more than 25 years of recovery efforts, the wild Mexican gray wolf population stands at approximately 240 animals. The program has survived multiple legal challenges, multiple changes in federal administration, significant political opposition from ranching communities and state governments in both Arizona and New Mexico, and persistent debates about management protocols. It has made measurable progress. It has also demonstrated, in real time, how difficult it is to sustain a large carnivore recovery program in the American Southwest against the political, economic, and social pressures that such programs generate. If jaguar recovery ever reaches the point of deliberate reintroduction of breeding females from Mexico, which the recovery plan contemplates as a potential management tool if natural colonization fails, it will face all of the same pressures that the wolf program has faced, with the added complexity of the international source population and the border security overlay. The 8 jaguars in 30 years have produced something beyond trail camera images. They have produced a body of scientific work, a legal and administrative record, a conservation infrastructure, and a public attachment to the idea of jaguar recovery in the United States that did not exist before 1996. Warner Glenn's photographs started a process that has continued to build, unevenly and against significant resistance, across nearly 3 decades. The critical habitat designation, the recovery plan, the monitoring network, the binational coordination framework, the legal precedents establishing that the Fish and Wildlife Service has affirmative obligations to the jaguar in the United States. All of these represent real institutional achievements that would not exist without the record of documented jaguars that made them legally and politically possible. The 8th jaguar accepts that record. It provides additional evidence of continued movement and continued connectivity. It maintains the public salience of the issue in a way that is necessary for the sustained attention that recovery requires. It is not, by itself, recovery, but it is evidence that the process that could produce recovery has not been foreclosed, that the biological mechanism of dispersal from Mexico into Arizona continues to function, and that the window for recovery-scale action remains open, if narrowly and conditionally. What the next 8 jaguars, however many years it takes to document them, will represent depends on decisions being made right now about the landscape those animals will move through. It depends on what happens to the Sonoran jaguar population in Mexico as the Sierra Madre foothills continue to be developed, as prey populations there respond to drought and land use change, as ranching practices evolve or fail to evolve in response to the growing evidence that conflict reduction strategies can make jaguar coexistence economically viable. It depends on what happens to the border landscape as successive administrations make decisions about security infrastructure that have biological consequences neither intended nor assessed. It depends on whether the ranching families and communities of southeastern Arizona and southwestern New Mexico find in jaguar recovery something that aligns with rather than conflicts with their own interests in the land they have worked for generations. It depends on whether the federal commitment to jaguar recovery which has been legally established and administratively formalized, but has never been financially or politically robust, survives the political turbulence that has characterized American wildlife policy for the past decade, without the continuity of commitment that large carnivore recovery requires. The animal photographed in the Dos Cabezas Mountains in 2023 does not know any of this. It was doing what male jaguars in northwestern Sonora have been doing for as long as there have been male jaguars in northwestern Sonora that were large enough and confident enough to range beyond the territories of established older males. It was moving north. It was following the topographic and prey cues that define movement ecology in a landscape that was organized by evolution long before it was reorganized by roads and fences and international boundaries. It passed through the Dos Cabezas and left a series of images on a motion-triggered camera and then continued wherever it was going. It may still be in Arizona, it may have returned to Mexico, it may have been killed by a vehicle, by a rancher, by the attrition that removes a significant fraction of dispersing young male predators before they reach reproductive age. The monitoring network will look for it. The camera operators will check their images. The researchers will run spot pattern analyses against the existing database of documented individuals to determine whether it reappears and where. What the camera saw, stripped of all the policy context and biological complexity and historical weight that surrounds it, was an animal of extraordinary beauty, moving through a landscape that is still, despite everything, wild enough to receive it. The jaguar is the largest predator the Western Hemisphere produced. It is built for a continent that still has room for it in some places and is still deciding whether it has room for it in others. The Sky Island ranges of the American Southwest are among those places where the decision has not yet been made in any final or irreversible way. The animal in the Dos Cabezas Mountains was, in that sense, not just a jaguar. It was a question. The question that dispersing male jaguars have been asking of the American Southwest for 30 years, appearing at the edge of a landscape that could receive them, and waiting, without knowing they are waiting, for the conditions that would allow them to stay. The answer to that question is not written in trail camera images. It is not written in recovery plans or critical habitat maps or federal court decisions, though all of those things matter enormously. It is written in the cumulative weight of human choices about land, about predators, about borders, about what kind of continent we are interested in inhabiting. The 8 documented jaguars in 30 years are 8 opportunities to give an honest answer to that question. The 9th will be another. The question remains open. The landscape, for now, still receives the animals willing to ask it. The decisions that determine whether it continues to do so are not biological. They are political, economic, and moral. They belong entirely to us.